Hi there. Good morning to those in the US and Canada. Good afternoon, good evening to those in UK and Europe. Welcome to the September CISO briefing from the Cyber Hut. Today's topic is all about consumer identity and access management. My name is Simon Moffatt. I'm the founder and analyst at the Cyber Hut. And the real aim of this briefing really is to provide a real high-level overview of the consumer identity and access management space, a bit of a comparison to employee identity, look at some capabilities and requirements, and really provide a bit of a level set as to what's happening in this external digital identity facing side of the world. Pretty informal. Feel free to ask questions and jump into the chat and put some questions in the questions box there as we go along, and I will get those picked up and get those answered as we go along. Bit of an introduction to myself and who we are and what the Cyber Hut is actually doing in this space and what the sort of rationale is the business actually is. I've been in the identity space best part of 20 years through chance and through luck and through a bit of good fortune, I guess. Spent a bit of time in industry, the last, 14 years or so working with vendors and working with product organizations to deliver go-to-market strategies for B2C and B2B style identity management systems. And I've been really quite fortunate really to not only spend such a long time in one industry, but really spend a bit of time researching some of the key areas. And I was fortunate last year to spend a bit of time focusing just purely on B2C, and I managed to collate that information and put that into a book which is focused purely on consumer identity and access management and how to design some of those systems. And a lot of the material we'll cover today is from that said book. And in 2021, I essentially set up the Cyber Hut to work full-time as an independent analyst. And the Cyber Hut really has an origin that goes back over 10 years, which essentially was a blog and article site called InfoSec Professional, which was all focused on independent agnostic analysis of identity management, access management, and some of the broader information security vendors and organizations. That has essentially evolved into the Cyber Hut, and a bit of a name change there in 2018 with the sort of popularity of the word cyber, I guess. And in 2021, launched full-time as independent industry analyst, helping both the buy side, the sell side, and the sort of VC investment community on understanding some of the emerging patterns within authentication and authorization, digital identity, data security, encryption, and so on. And the way we do that is essentially through a body of research, looking to deliver independent cybersecurity industry research products from buyer's guides, RFP templates, helping the buy side understand and overcome some of the information asymmetries often associated with investing in complicated cybersecurity middleware and identity and access management systems. And part of the process involves things like vendor assessments and developing content which can allow the buy side to essentially understand that market better, whether it's an emerging market or a more established market. The other side of that, of course, is providing content, whether that's things like CISO briefings to the markets, white papers, articles, blogs, webinars, fireside chats, but again, helping to articulate, help it to create independent vision for what could well be emerging patterns, design trends, vendor mergers and acquisitions, and so on, but trying to provide that independent content, which is very much focused on the vendor and helping that to percolate through the communities. We also provide buy-side advisory, as you'd expect with an industry analyst firm, the ability to support the buy-side on their journey to deliver complicated identity and security architectures. Clearly, they evolve, they need to be designed, they need to be evaluated, they need to be optimized and improved. And we do that across a range of different areas, employee identity, consumer identity, authentication, authorization, and so on. Really, it's trying to help the buy side optimize either their existing investments or help them be in a position that their architecture can consume new components, new products, new vendors, etc. And we essentially do that across a range of specialized coverage areas. We are elite, we are specialized. We don't focus on areas we're not specialist in. Primarily authentication, authorization, identity, and identity governance, as well as things like application integration, general risk and threat controls, and a bit more newer research around embedded securities, things like IoT security and SIM card security, and how that can play out into a sort of broader device identity ecosystem as well. So that brings us to the CIAM space. So the idea of today, really 40 minutes or so, going to go through what is consumer identity, customer identity, citizen identity, bit of a comparison to employee identity, looking at some of the requirements, some of the capabilities, looking at some of the vendors in this space and what they try and offer and what they try to deliver, and wrap up with a bit of discussion on metrics and how to measure success in that space. So before I sort of dig into some of that material, first thing we should all do really is sort of park our hats, if you like, as identity experts or those with an interest in identity and security, and start to think of ourselves as consumers, as customers, as Simon, who just happens to use his Android phone to do his online banking, or Simon, who happens to go and buy car insurance, which I did yesterday. And it was an actually very, very good experience. Actually, it wasn't an ugly face of insurance at all. It was actually quite pleasant. But we all have stories and experiences of where we've had a really bad experience registering for a particular service, having to authenticate via a mobile phone with a complex password, attempting to pin and pair our televisions, for example, or even trying to log in to a smart TV with a remote control. I mean, it's a terrible experience. Trying to register for a service or register for car insurance like I did this week, and having to provide bucket loads of information, attribute information, your pet, what school you went to 30 years ago, all this sort of stuff. We've all got these terrible stories of how that made you feel. And you sort of get sidetracked away from the actual service or the thing that you were looking to purchase or complete, and you get blocked. And the thing you remember is this terrible interaction, the registration, the login, all of those mechanics, which essentially should possibly be as transparent as they could be. And that's the thing which you remember, the poor error handling, the lack of consent, the inability to even remove yourself and deregister from a particular service. And that's the stuff which people remember. And that's the stuff people talk about if you happen to get it wrong. But unfortunately, that is really only the tip of the iceberg. The end user, they may well see the application essentially as the user interface. They don't really care what happens under the hood of your mobile app. They don't care whether it's microservices, whether it's written in Java, whether it's actually a really legacy application with an API gateway being thrown in front of it. They don't care about that. They care about the app on their phone or the website that they're accessing on their laptop. They care about that user experience. But as a service provider, under the hood, there is a whole host of different components which need to be engaged, need to be designed, integrated to deliver a seamless digital experience for consumers, customers, and citizens. We're talking about compliance, things like GDPR and CCPA, PSD2, and lots of other funky acronyms we'll come to later on. Are you compliant? Are you in a position to capture information and securely store it and share it? Do you have the consent to be able to even share it? Does this platform hit and meet the business objectives? Who are the stakeholders in this organization that is powering and allowing this digital transformation initiative to take place? What about future proofing? What about data protection? What about consent handling? What about evolving threats? The employee side has always had issues around security. That's no different to an external consumer or customer facing identity platform. Threats continually evolve, and there's a whole host of non-functional aspects to consider as well. Things like scalability, elasticity, the ability to roll out a service to hit peak demand, which could well be into the hundreds of thousands or the millions if this is a large internet facing system. How can you roll that stuff back? So there's a whole host of different functional and non-functional requirements which underpin this user experience. Whether that user experience is good or bad, there's a whole host of things underneath which the service provider has to either build themselves or leverage a off-the-shelf platform to assist in. So there's a whole brand new host of use cases which need to be considered. And we can start to boil that down a little bit more into essentially a life cycle of consumer identity and access management. And the interesting thing here is this life cycle we've got this sort of infinity symbol here, where it's just a continual evolving capturing and processing of identity information, which may well be actually quite subtly different to the employee space, which may well have been, in the past at least, quite linear. You start with an HR system, you provision that identity into downstream systems like LDAPs, databases, mainframes. The employee may move jobs, so you alter their access using role-based access control, and you may review that. But it's quite linear. It's a top-down process. And then obviously the employee leaves as part of their joiner, mover, leaver process. And then there's an aspect of disabling accounts and eventually removing accounts, where in the consumer space, things are much more dynamic, much more fluid. And there's a whole host of subtle differences I'll cover in the next 10 or 15 minutes. But we've sort of got this sort of 9, 10, 12 individual components which a consumer identity may well go through. They're going to go through this onboarding aspect. They're going to register or perhaps be invited to register onto a particular service. And there's going to be different levels of assurance associated with that identity. They may well go through a formal proofing mechanism, providing a government issued identity, perhaps a driving license or a passport, or may well go through a mechanism of taking a picture of that government issued identity, validating it, comparing it to the original source, binding that to the actual physical person who is doing the registration process, bind that to a mobile device, maybe pair that with some sort of secure login. Is that going to be biometric led? Is it going to be something simple like a push authentication? We want to do some sort of binding between the digital representation of their physical world via that proofing aspect and somehow bind that to a device, typically a mobile phone perhaps. And then that floods into things like contextual and adaptive access. So we have this identity which has been proofed, we're sort of binding that with maybe some cryptographic keys on a device, but clearly the context of how they authenticate, how they access those services may well alter and change. So you're looking at their location, you're looking at their previous transactions, you're looking at what they've done in comparison to their peers, for example, and leveraging that context with things like threat intelligence and breach credentials analysis to try and work out what this person can do next. And what they do next in the consumer space is very interesting. This brings a whole host of new use cases around consent management. What information have they shared to the service provider? What consent have they explicitly given regarding that information, whether it's transaction information or PII, personal identifiable information? What data integration sources are going to be required? So that could be anything from a simple sort of CRM system or a Salesforce mechanism to track them as a purchaser, through to tracking if it's e-commerce, through to transactions if it's credit card and financial services. There's a whole host of data integration points. Some will need to be anonymized, some will be entirely tokenized perhaps, or even pseudo-anonymized if there's some sort of analytics that needs to take place there. But this whole host of profile consent and data management triad brings a whole host of new use cases. What information is being shared when? Can it be revoked? Why was that information shared? What's the impact if they stop sharing it? And all of that needs to be rooted in a whole security first and privacy first ecosystem. And again, this isn't linear. When I was doing my registration for my car insurance yesterday, the initial point of contact was just essentially me putting my number plate in, the car number registration plate in first. Then it starts to snowball. If those initial values and prices look okay, I then start to provide my name, my address, my date of birth, my driving history, and so on. And that progressive snowballing of me providing more information to the insurance provider allowed them to give me a personalized experience. So there's that whole host of again, going maybe back through this loop, maybe additional proofing may take place if I provide more information, additional consent management if I provide more information, and so on and so forth. So we have this aspect of this continual flow. We have this aspect of lots of different interactions. We have this flow essentially around looking at things like identity assurance and authentication levels of assurance. But ultimately, we have to boil that back into that blue bar across the top, that business focus, acquire, personalize, build trust, and retain objective. And this is really nothing to do with identity and security. It's really to do with what the business is trying to do for a commercialization aspect. They want to acquire customers or consumers. They want to personalize content. They want to deliver, it could be adverts, it could be a personalized experience, it could be a personalized shopping experience. They want to deliver something personal, essentially to retain them, get that customer or consumer to refer to somebody else. But it's always got to be deeply rooted into that sort of 4 pillars, if you like, of standard commercialization or business objectives. And somehow, we then have to try and bolt in this consumer angle to it and provide a whole host of identity and access services to allow those business objectives to take place. So I've thrown this life cycle up and I've talked about login, MFA, and a few of the bits and bobs. It's like, well, look, isn't that just identity and access management? We've done that stuff in the past. I'm familiar with registration and proofing, and that's similar to what we do in the employee space. Well, actually, no, it's not. It's subtly and fundamentally very different. If we look at an organization with a sort of invisible operational boundary, but what it can control and what it doesn't control, and essentially we're talking about employee identity as being this very much inside out aspect. It's very much about controlling employee access. It's about operational efficiency, reducing error, increasing productivity of the staff, but it's very much done within the confines of a controlled ecosystem. Organizations typically control who works for them. They may not control actually what customers they get. That's a very much an uncontrolled aspect. So we have this inside out pushing of employee identity versus this outside in aspect from a consumer or customer identity. You're trying to expose resources essentially to an unknown person. Yes, they'll go through profiling, proofing, and verifications, but you're opening up an inside service to an outside capability, and that can create conflict. It can also create economies of scale if you can leverage some concepts in both areas, but there are fundamental differences with regards to use cases, non-functional and functional requirements, stakeholders, business objectives, funding. Who funds these different systems is going to come from different parts of the business. So it's important to start thinking, actually, on the face of things, there may well be terminology which is similar, but actually from a high meta level, they are actually very different. Comparisons often use Venn diagrams, and it wouldn't be the same without having a Venn diagram here. And I picked out some of the non-functional functional capabilities, not all of them, of course, but some of the big ones which tend to exist in the employee IAM and the sort of B2C CIAM space. Clearly, there's overlap. We're talking about things like authentication. We've got a bit of single sign-on, a bit of MFA stuff in there. There's going to be a central directory or database of some sort to store material. Clearly, there's going to be authentication in there as well. But maybe if you start to then look at the extremes, well, on the CIAM side, we're very much user-centric. It's a user-centric design aspect. We're talking about privacy first. We're trying to provide a whole host of self-service capabilities to the consumer. In the employee identity space, it's very much systems-centric integrations, workflows, HR. You're talking perhaps many systems with deep integrations versus the CIAM side, which may be actually quite shallow, but things like scaling and the non-functional throughput is going to be very, very different. So there's going to be both non-functional and functional aspects, which would be very, very different, I think. Amplify this a little bit further. Clearly, if you look at the who, the what, the where, the why, and the when, very, very different aspects. The consumer is very much focused on themselves, their experience. They want this experience across a multitude of different devices. They expect it 365 days a year. They may well be accessing fewer applications with lower and simple integrations, but they want to have that on a device of their choice at a timing of their choosing. And the service provider may well have to scale, not only in volume to millions of users, but clearly to thousands of transactions a second for registrations, authentications, authorizations, etc. And then there's a few odd things around assurance and things like data ownership. Clearly in the public space, assurance may well start from nothing and leverage maybe a social media identity provider, which doesn't really provide any assurance at all, right the way through to that proofing aspect I mentioned earlier in strong levels of KYC. Clearly the employee space, that problem sort of disappears to an extent. We're leveraging an HR system, but that HR system equally needs to be fed often with government issued documents, proof of address and driving license, etc. So the assurance level does alter, and it's handled and owned in subtly different ways, I think. Another amplification, just the difference aspect, is essentially IAM for the employee space is functioning around operational efficiencies, looking to save money. You make the investment within an off-the-shelf employee or governance system. There's big, strong investment up front, but the saving is really about operational saving. It may well stop you from being fined from a compliance perspective, or it will increase productivity because it reduces the employee onboarding time by a number of days or hours, but it's about saving cash. The consumer space is very, very much focused on generating revenue. If you're looking to increase consumption of a particular service or a particular resource, typically with a monetary gain at some point, the selling of a service, the selling of insurance, the selling of movies or films or media. So after that initial investment hump, you're going to see the consumption increase. You're going to see that red bar increase a lot more over time. Of course, it won't happen overnight, but over 3, 4, 6, 12, 18 months, you'd expect more users to engage and register on the system. And that is hopefully going to push up revenue over a period of time. So there's, again, when you start to look at the economics and the benefits of the two different systems, you can then start to identify actually the stakeholders would be different. And obviously the budget release mechanisms will be very different as well. Consumer identity is pretty big business. The market isn't clearly as large as the employee side, but there are huge benefits for organizations going through this digital transformation initiative and looking to go and deliver a digital platform based on the engagement of consumers and citizens. And again, we start to see this dichotomy between benefits to the providers and benefits to the consumers essentially collapsing and becoming a singular thing, which I think is pretty powerful. So clearly for the provider side, to have that innovation aspect, if things are digital, they have a mechanism to innovate, deliver new products, deliver new services. They can respond to change faster, and they're probably in a much better position to be protected from threats. And I don't really mean those threats from a security perspective. It may well be threats really from a competitive landscape as well. It's the ability to be adaptive and agile. Clearly from a consumer perspective, it is the age of the consumer. They have a need, that level of personalization. They want to have everything on demand, on a device of their choosing, at a time of their choosing. And if that doesn't happen for them, they really would be one click away from moving to a competitor. So the power really is in the hands of the consumer. They can research their provider at will. They can compare, they can contrast. And if what they perceive is not the level of service they wish to have, clearly they're one click away from removing their account and going elsewhere. Very, very different, clearly, in the physical world where that perhaps isn't as easy to do. So the benefits are on twofold, which I think is why this industry is suddenly growing pretty rapidly over the last 4 or 5 years, because there are benefits to both the providers and to the end users. That was a bit of a sort of high-level rattle through there. I want to spend a bit of a deeper dive, really, the next sort of 15, 20 minutes, just looking at some of the capabilities in this space, looking at some of what you would expect a provider or a vendor in this space to look to deliver, and then take a bit of a peek at what some of those vendors look like. So what we're looking at from a CIAM perspective, and it's quite easy to split that into the functional and non-functional. And again, I've only picked out half a dozen of each here, but there are a few others which could be bucketed into the same area. But I guess from a functional perspective, some things which look slightly different than the employee lifecycle. I think number one is this ability to be very light and progressive in how you register for a particular service. I think something which is certainly emerging is this concept of smart profiling or progressive profiling, where you only provide information to the service provider if there's a very, very, very clear benefit to the consumer. There's no point asking them for 10 different attributes if actually all they need is a quote, or all they need is to view a newspaper article or something. It has to be an exchange of wants. If they provide information, they want a benefit back in return. It has to be a very clean explanation as to what information is being collected. So we start to see this light or progressive profiling aspect as to how they register. Privacy by design and consent lifecycle, again, very new to some organizations because they've been very much focused on the employee space. So again, we're talking about providing explicit consent, ability to store that, and I'll discuss the consent lifecycle actually in a couple of slides' time, I think. Multi-device. These devices will be bring your own device. They'll be uncontrolled, unmanaged. There'll be different versions, different operating systems, different levels of hardware. Very difficult for a service provider to control and maintain things like testing matrices and supportability for a whole host of different device types. And suddenly you start to add in things like IoT as well, smart devices and constrained devices, smart TVs, wearable technology, healthcare wearable, sports technologies. How can you apply identity into those devices that can represent a consumer? And then we start to talk about profile and data management there as well. What information have they shared to the service provider? Can they see it? Can they edit it? Can they change it? That stuff will be continually changing as well. On non-functionals, scale is huge, we know this, but there's interesting aspects around being highly available and being elastic as well. Scaling it's a strange one in the sense of, you may think, well, okay, I expect to have 50,000, 100,000 or 10,000 people using my system, but clearly that is a guess. There's no real way of knowing that unless it's an invited sort of participation, which you may get in things like energy bills and utilities, where you sort of inviting your customer to sign up to a particular service. But realistically, there will well be spikes and troughs in demand for usage, typical in things like media and sporting applications, where you may well have a huge Super Bowl event or FA Cup final where there's a huge surge in demand for a service, huge authentications per second. But then clearly by Monday morning, the drama's passed, the event is over, and suddenly the authentications dip by 80%. Can your infrastructure then reverse engineer and become back to a minimal level of service? How can it sort of reverse collapse? And things like containerization and Kubernetes and elastic scaling can help to pull back some of those resources if they've been committed up front. Other things which often get forgotten about: being distributed, being localized. Can you deliver services in regions which maybe have different character sets? Can you provide local information? Can you allow the end user to be entirely self-sufficient and essentially handle all of their self-service requests in different languages, again, at time of their choosing, a device of their choosing? So you have to be distributed, you have to be localized, support different locales. So again, you're instantly starting to see functional, non-functionals very, very different to the identity and access management space for employees, which again is much more controlled, and there's much more knowledge upfront of what those capabilities may well look like. There's a couple of capabilities I want to pull out is explicitly being very different, I think, in the consumer space. One is consent. Two major ones which sort of apply here, really: the GDPR for Europe, CCPA in the US, of course. But again, the sort of meta takeaway here is there's a life cycle. So what does that mean? Well, we're looking to capture consent. Well, what does that look like? Well, we need an affirmative action to get the end user to explicitly say, yes, I want to share this piece of information or this transaction or this block of data to the service provider. Once that's been captured, you have to store that consent record. What does a consent record look like? Well, it could be in a standards format. There are numerous different initiatives. Various standards bodies, like the Kantara initiative is one, which has a thread around consent receipts and how to define a receipt and what information needs to go into a consent receipt. How can that be stored in a way which is essentially tamper resistant? I hesitate to use the word tamper proof because there aren't many things which are tamper proof, but tamper resistant. And also, can that consent be revoked if I decide to take my access away and prevent a clinical practitioner seeing my medical records? A, can I do that? And B, what impact does that have to me as a consumer if I decide to revoke and remove access to a particular piece of information or a set of transactions? And clearly, can that be audited? Is there a tamper resistant method that can go through and look at each of those interactions? Have they been signed? Have they been stored correctly? Can that be then audited by a third party? Lots of new requirements, lots of emerging trends and standards there. 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of this was in its infancy. It's starting to stabilize a little bit more now. But again, these are new things if you're looking to build out external facing systems, which perhaps in the employee space were possibly less relevant, or certainly were maybe less important for certain use cases. The other capability in this area, which is again a little bit of a paradox, really. If you talk about consent, where I need to share as much information as I can with the service provider in order to gain access to a system, the more information I provide, the more personalized the experience, which is a bit of a odd paradox, really, because clearly me as a end user, Joe end user, I don't want to share my information. I want my information to be kept private. But for me to get a personalized experience, I need to share more. So that's one conflict. The second conflict is this one around usability versus security. Usability in the CIAM space is hugely important. It's essentially a user-centric design process we are going through. And we're looking at metrics which are very, I guess, unusual to a security practitioner. We're talking about task completion, length of time, happiness. How do you measure happiness? Was I satisfied through my insurance purchasing process yesterday? As it happened, I actually was quite happy. I was happy with the price, probably more than the experience, actually, but I was satisfied by the end of it. I managed to do the process entirely self-sufficiently. I didn't need to speak to anybody. I didn't need a chatbot. I didn't get stuck. It was very simple. There was help on offer if I needed it. I didn't make any errors, I don't think, and so on. But so those usability metrics are certainly in conflict sometimes with the security angle, where you're talking about coverage, you're talking about quite detailed controls, authentication failures, authorization failures, blocked firewall requests, risk assessment, coverage of patches, and so on. So your metrics really on the security side are quite control-led, individual. They don't often bolt into business outcome. So somehow we need to blend the two together. And that blended experience is looking to certainly identify personas. We all, age, sex, geographical locations, we all have different ways of behaving, different choices that we need to make. So you need to focus your service on those different personas, the age groups, locations, etc. Who are these people that are going to be using the system? Offer them choice, capture choice, replay that choice to the end user. Allow your system to be adaptive. So respond to any change that they provide to you, whether that is a change regarding their choice, whether it's a change in their behavior, maybe it's a change not only within themselves, but perhaps within a comparison to peer groups. So if there's an end user who suddenly is perhaps clicking or using a system differently, their transaction history and volume is different to their peer groups, be adaptive to that. Is it a security risk, or actually is it an opportunity to maybe sell a different service, for example? So somehow you need to try and look and identify and deliver this blended experience and not have the two be in conflict, because ultimately if you deliver a highly secure system, it's going to be unlikely to be attractive from a user experience perspective. And clearly, if it is highly usable and configurable, it may well not pass the security tests as well. So there has to be a happy medium somewhere along the lines. All right, so rattle through a bit of a comparison to employee identity. We're talking a little bit about some of the capabilities. Who are the main, well, I guess the most vocalized of players in this space over the last 5 to 7 years? And these have been bucketed in three main categories, I guess. Number one is this sort of genus relating to the origins of identity and access management. So they've essentially come from the employee space. They've been very much focused on delivering capabilities for contractors, for staff, for joint ventures, for partnerships, federated partnerships, very much focused on the staffing aspect. Broadcom, previously CA, Computer Associates, IBM, again, the Tivoli stack, long history in providing a host of provisioning, governance, access management, single sign-on systems. ForgeRock, again, the origins from some microsystems focused on OpenSSO and OpenDS, the two open source components, which they then augmented with things like their identity gateway and identity management, identity governance, autonomous access and stuff, which they've added in there. And we've got this sort of arrow going from Auth0 to Okta. Obviously, Okta purchased Auth0 for a pretty big price earlier on this year. And clearly, the interesting aspect here is you can basically say, you know, Okta were really much focused on that cloud single sign-on set of use cases originally, integrating with on-premise directories and allowing that single sign-on sort of federation, if you like, into those cloud systems like Salesforce and WebEx and all that stuff. Prior to the acquisition of Auth0, they started to branch out into the consumer space as well, typically for SMEs, essentially. It's quite interesting to read their S1 and try and look at where their revenue generation comes from. And they were looking to break out of purely B2E and look at attack that B2C space. But clearly they then acquired Auth0, who essentially, you could argue, were a bit of a first principles emerging provider of identity. Developer first, very much focused on the API, very much focused on the developer experience. That acquisition gives Octazero, or whatever their new name may well be, I think they're actually keeping the brands separate, probably quite rightly as well. It gives them an interesting set of capabilities to focus purely on that SaaS business, easy to use focus for Okta, and obviously that developer first aspect for Auth0. And they, I guess, can attack that CIAM space from two different, probably slightly separate angles there. There's a few vendors which originated from the marketing view of the world. So identity was very much about operations and security and standards and integrations. Marketing is very much focused on things like customer experience, onboarding. How quick can you onboard new customers or new consumers into your service? So social media integration, lots of deep analytics around who are these people using your system, ages, locations, behaviors, where are they coming from, what devices are they using? How can you fine grain that analysis to deliver subtle changes in their life cycle to essentially deliver them and nudge them into your service and do that in a much deeper way. And two unusual names in SAP and Akamai, they actually made some acquisitions. So SAP and Akamai purchased two companies called Janrain and Gigia a few years back, and Janrain and Gigia were very much standalone, very much focused on that marketing set of use cases, which has obviously been rolled up now into SAP and Akamai, being rebranded slightly. Over the last 3 or 4 years, we started to see some emerging providers, dedicated cloud-first entities who are purely focused just on that consumer aspect and taking a few subtly different methods to do that. Again, typically API first, typically breaking down the consumer lifecycle into that consumer experience angle, as well as being very flexible and agile when it comes to security controls, very modular in things like authentication, authorization, account takeover, bot protection, etc. But then overlaying the customer experience with strong support for privacy, consent capture, privacy workflow, privacy storage and consent, and the ability to integrate those consent use cases into downstream systems. So we sort of see those as emerging in the sense of they're pure play. They haven't got that, I guess, baggage, if you want to call it that, from an identity and marketing perspective, but they've sort of merged those two views of the world together, and taking the standards, taking our API first. Cloud and mobile SDK is a real accelerator, but delivering both the customer experience and the security and scalability aspects, which CIAM really starts to require. It would be amiss really to talk about any identity and or security project without mentioning the big three. What we're looking at here is actually some of their terminologies. This is how what they think is important in the CIAM space. Now, this is actually quite subtle and quite interesting. I think if you look at similarities between the two, you start to pull out things like standards support. So OpenID Connect or Auth2, SAML is pretty consistent amongst their verbiage that they push out from their release notes and everything else. We talk about profiling and proofing, not always consistent across the three. They've all got their own individual brands. So Azure B2C, Google Identity Platform, Cognito, they're looking to build out and develop a brand separate to the mothership, separate to Microsoft, for example, or separate to Google. Google's quite interesting. They like they've certainly doubled down and amplified on the capabilities which you sort of get for free because it's Google. So we're talking about Google Grid authentication. They've got a lot of authentication options there. Planet scale, I guess you sort of assume that would come from the Google infrastructure and their experience and knowledge of that. And they also think things like multi-tenancy and the sort of 99.95 SLA is important. You could argue the toss whether 99.95 is too low for CIAM. I think, in honesty, I think all three are relatively similar in that respect. But it's interesting to see what they think is important. If you look at that from a set of capabilities perspective and overlay that to the CIAM lifecycle, they probably fall short actually in quite a few areas. But for some projects, if your customer or your client, or even if you are working with Amazon, for example, the Amazon Cognito stuff may well be enough. You know, if you're a Microsoft only shop, the Microsoft CIAM might just be enough. It's unlikely to provide detailed and future-proofed capabilities because clearly they're not a pure B2C provider. They have a whole host of other things. Google have a whole host of other things. but clearly they're starting to tip their toes into this digital identity space. And that is quite interesting to observe. The pricing is also interesting. You'll notice the first 50,000 users are free, essentially monthly active users for some basic capabilities. Again, looking to amplify the fact that they aren't specialists in this space. They want to capture that market, essentially to probably block other vendors coming in and essentially get them to consume more infrastructure, which is essentially what those big three are looking to sort of make their revenue from. But it's interesting, the release notes for these things get updated pretty rapidly. This capability has been added on pretty rapidly as well. So it's quite interesting to observe where they're heading to in this space. You start to look at some vendor meta patterns, API first, REST APIs. You want to be able to integrate CIAM services and that CIAM lifecycle into a whole host of different settings, and you can do that through APIs. Sometimes accelerating that with extensions, samples, SDKs to help with the embeddability, but certainly API first is the order of the day. The ability to scale with elastic reduction, I think, is pretty common as well. Strong understanding of data privacy and local compliance. And that could be very local in the sense of even some countries, instead of just continental GDPR, it could well be very specific to certain regions. Modular and adaptive with respect to security. Security and privacy actually very much seen now as a given, but clearly these things evolve and they adapt rapidly. So multi-factor authentication, passwordless account takeover, adaptive access, continual security, zero trust, all of those buzzwords are continually evolving. Integrations to threat intelligence systems as well. Pushing CIAM and digital identity into the IoT world, both for constrained and smart devices, smart TVs, wearables. How do you do that? API first probably isn't enough. You probably need an SDK of some sort to do that. And clearly have strong support for the major standards, OpenID Connect, WebAuth 2, FIDO2. WebAuth, I should say, FIDO2. Less so SAML, I guess, but SAML is often useful to get identities into a repository if perhaps there's sort of different brands or different external brands being put in play there. So vendors, yeah, they're great, they're providing capabilities, but how do you start to measure success here? And this is, again, something different really from the employee space. There's a couple of good documents on identity metrics from like Gartner and others. And there's three main blocks to think about. One is coverage, one is performance, one is effectiveness. So again, on the left-hand side, you can pull out a particular control or outcome type. Number of users is a really obvious one because you think, well, okay, yeah, number of users in a system is a decent metric. But then you start to think, well, actually, hang on, that's a coverage point. What about performance? Can they do that over a long period of time? Can they hit particular throughput levels and numbers? Can they register in an effective way? Can they log in an effective way? Can they do so on their device, a range of locations, different languages? Can they do that in a way which doesn't require the help desk, for example? What happens if I lose my mobile banking app? Can I continue to use my banking services in a way which is self-sufficient? Is that an effective, happy user to do that? So it's interesting and important really to break out the thing that you want to measure into those coverage, performance, and effectiveness buckets, and then you can start to build out business case and build out both quantitative and qualitative values against that to try and look and see if something is successful. Capture the responses, and then obviously then that rolls into either expanding a business case to make changes or make technical changes with the actual provider themselves. But the metrics aspect is vitally important. And there's some real subtle components being developed on things like authentication metrics, on things like authorization metrics, analytics around usability and behaviors, and how a user moves around a particular web page, and how you can capture that with things like client-side JavaScript, anonymize it, and then tag that into an actual real identity in a sort of pseudo-anonymized way. You need to be able to provide that data into this measuring success area, which is again, from an identity perspective for employees, it was probably pretty much unheard of, I think. After all that talking for 45 minutes, high speed. The really interesting thing is success probably looks invisible, and eagle eyes of you would obviously understand the yellow buttons there from Amazon. And Cyberport doesn't have any relationship with Amazon at all, but we're all relatively familiar with how Amazon works. Big online e-commerce, you can buy everything you want from Amazon. I've got it on my mobile phone. I don't remember the last time I authenticated and logged into Amazon. I clearly did at some point. It's all happening in the background. My behavior, long-lived access from fresh tokens, things are happening transparently in the background. If I make a big purchase, and perhaps I change the delivery address to one which is unheard of, may well be a bit of friction being applied and a bit of interruption to that user flow. But typically, it's invisible. I continually logged in. I perform events, transactions, searches within Amazon, and then the transaction is completed. I don't notice it, which is the interesting aspect. So all of those requirements, that life cycle, and all that stuff we've been talking about, somehow you have to automatically deliver that as an invisible set of use cases to an extent. I think the end users expect a bit of friction, but somehow if you can deliver it invisibly, you're probably on to a decent level of success there with regards to the security aspect and, of course, the usability aspect, which is the holy grail, I think, of delivering these sorts of platforms. One to read more, that was clearly a very, very quick, fast, dirty view of what CIAM seems to be all about. There is a book on the topic, which was released earlier this year, Consumer Identity Design Fundamentals, looking at the history of requirements, the vendor overviews, some technical components in there as well, how to build out business requirements analysis and start to analyze and understand what is needed, either from a consultancy perspective or within industry itself, around what does consumer identity look like. So that is available on Amazon in most geographical regions. And there's also a new course which is being released. It was in a beta trial over the summer. That's been released now in September. Again, going through that deep dive life cycle, I think it's like 10, 11 hours of content there around what is the CIAM life cycle? What are those use cases? How do you build out some of those systems in a vendor agnostic way? And there'll be a coupon code posted into the event chat on LinkedIn, I think either today or tomorrow. That was pretty fast. Any questions that are coming through? Put them through now. We've got a few more minutes to go. Otherwise, I could leave you for the rest of your day.